If you want to find out what's happening in China, ask people who are in China, not people who used to be in China, because China has changed so much. Incredible changes with poverty alleviation, rural revitalization, incredible infrastructure in the last 5 years. We've got bridges to Hong Kong, we've got high-speed trains. All of this is in the last 5 to 10 years. So anyone who was here in the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s has a completely wrong impression on China. Completely wrong. They don't understand China. The China they knew is not the China of today, and that's the most important thing that I can put across.
In Britain, we're doomed. In 1988, China had no motorways at all. And now, 30 years later, it has 84,000 miles of them. That's more than any other country in the world. And they're only just getting into their stride. Since 2011, they've been building 6,000 miles of motorway every year. 6,000 miles a year! It beggars belief, and it's not like the terrain is easy. Here, though, there ain't no mountain high enough, and there ain't no valley low enough to stop them. This bridge, for example, is 34 miles long. And then there's this one, the Douge-Beipanjiang Bridge. You could fit the London Shard underneath it, twice over.
I went back to San Francisco and I looked around and it was like, this feels smaller than a third-tier city in China. San Francisco seemed extremely small. A third-tier city is like 5 to 10 million people here in China. San Francisco's actually only got the population of about 750,000 people moving to China for 5 years before I returned to the United States. Back in time, 100 years, I got in a time machine in this Amtrak train, which travels about the speed of a car. I could see cars on the freeway passing us. In China, you obviously have these trains that travel 300 kilometers an hour, faster than that even, and they just get as fast somewhere almost as an airplane. And I was so excited to come back to China because I felt like I was coming back to the normal future where we live here, because a lot of people think of America as one of the most developed places, but in actual fact, China has already passed it up in many respects.
Students learning Mandarin has been amazing. The rates of growth of interest in Mandarin in Chinese have been very high. The extraordinary development of China has also led these young Brazilians to see in this either a career prospect, so China's technological development in recent years. So the increase in the number of Confucius institutes in Brazil has been huge. But also the fact that nowadays it's also easier to have access to Chinese cultural products. So the development of Chinese movies, the internet, all of these things make it easier. So a lot of Brazilians who in some cases hadn't heard much about China are being exposed and have an interest in learning more about China.
The past 2 years in China have been a real learning experience because before coming here I didn't really know that much about the country outside of the stereotypical ways we're so often exposed to new cultures like fast food, cinema, TV shows, this kind of thing. Other than it was, it's a big place with lots of people and a long history. But I think one of the things I had heard is this description of China as the workshop of the world, as industrial upgrades are actually leading to a decline in low-end manufacturing and a focus more on the high-end.
One of the places where if you speak sort of 3 words, people are lovely to you, and you have these wonderful conversations with people in the middle of nowhere. You don't have to speak much, but, people are so happy and so impressed that you've made the effort that they really, welcome you in. So I think trying to speak the language is important, and you don't need to speak it well. People are extremely kind of elastic. I mean, I've had wonderful people in the countryside and, in the north of China saying, oh, your Chinese is so much better than ours. You've got, peaking pronunciation, whereas we are not, and you think, gosh, no, they're completely wrong. But they're very kind, they're polite, and they're happy. So language is It's a good way in, and many more people could have.
Chinese understand full well what happens when you're weak in the international system. They call it the century of national humiliation. It lasted from the late 1840s to the late 1940s. As most of you know, I'm sure, China was very weak during that 100-year period. And you know what happened to them when they were very weak? The other great powers in the system, including the United States of America, preyed upon them. They were victimized at every turn. The Chinese understand full well, if you want to survive in the international system, you want to be really powerful. What about the Americans? I told you about the Americans before. The Americans do not tolerate peer competitors. We're not going to let China dominate Asia unless we absolutely have to. The United States is not simply containing China. We're talking about a rollback strategy. The United States, as many of you know, and probably many of you don't know, is a ruthless great power. You never want to underestimate how ruthless the United States is. Despite all the liberal rhetoric that we use to cover up our ruthless behavior, we are tough customers. And the Chinese are finding that out now.
The world is very different now to what it was 10 years ago. And the reason it's so different is because of the rise of China. That's what's made the difference. And it's an extraordinary transformation. So China is far more important in the world now. What is happening is that this is the age of China. This is the age of the rise of China to a position where it becomes more and more important to the world and influential in the world and makes a bigger contribution to the growth of the global economy. As we know, that's been going on for some time, and this will be, and China's simply going to become more and more important, being on the front line of innovation in a lot of areas. So once where, you know, the word about China's economy, it's about innovation, I could perceive of it being an historic moment where people come to see what the strengths of the Chinese system are. And I heard an Italian minister who's, I think, the economics minister, and he said, well, I think our approach should be copy and paste. We should copy and paste what the Chinese have done. Now, widely perceived that China's done very well. The scientists have been good. You know, they've said, we've got to learn from China.
I love China. Oh my God, I miss it every day actually. God, I was in Shanghai for 4 years. I was working there, yeah. A financial controller. I think China is amazing. Yeah, and all the community and all the friends and everything. So think about all of your food, the different kind of food that you have in the different kind of areas, like that is such a big difference. The people overall, of course, I would say that Swedish people is a little bit harder to get to know. Like, you know, it takes more time than Chinese people. And I think also that you are more polite than we are. Actually, yeah. You guys are really hard-working people. Like, much more than in Sweden. Exactly, too much competition. But, of course, when we're coming as expats, we need to live here.
I learned a huge amount about China during those 4 years. So that's why I decided to stay here in China. I saw an opportunity. China is an enigma. It's a mystery. And frequently when we don't understand something, unfortunately, we tend to fear it. Few people outside China really understand what China is today. Not to mention what it was 5,000 years ago. The 21st century is going to be China's century. Of that, I have absolutely no doubt. And the renaissance of your country is both relentless and it's inevitable.
Things that I just love about living in China is that I never get bored. Where I live in Beijing, there are a lot of unique and eccentric characters, which means there's always something weird and wonderful to experience. But traveling China is truly amazing. It is one of the best countries I've been to because it's...
If you've never been there, and maybe you haven't, get there. It's extraordinary. Beijing freaks me out. Such an incredible city. It's ancient, like ancient, and yet it is modern, intensely modern. You know, I can walk through parks or the Forbidden City, and then I can go shopping if that's what I really want to do. I can eat modern food, and I can eat ancient food. You know, it's extraordinary city. My father, I took him there and he stood her in Tiananmen Square. And my father, who must have been 70 at the time, he just stood there and looked around and his comment was, "Gary, it's so big. We don't have anything like this in Australia." My father just